This is the PowKiddy RGB30. It released about 4 months ago, and despite getting positive reviews and ending up on a lot of best handhelds of 2023 lists, I didn't initially see the attraction. It kinda just looked like a squashed PowKiddy RGB10 Max 3 Pro with worse specs. But it turns out that I might have been too quick to judge, and after spending a bit of time with it, I actually think that in a way, this represents the future of handheld devices. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, so let's take things back and ask, why would you want to buy a device like this when there's so many other more powerful options available, and what's the big attraction with this weirdly shaped screen? Well, let's take a look. When you get your mitts on a fresh emulation device, you're probably excited to get it set up and start testing it out. Listen, I get it, I've gone through this process a few times myself, but something that's easy to overlook when you're lost in a sea of pixels is the fact that you do actually need to eat something. That's where today's sponsor comes in. HelloFresh is a recipe box delivery service which provides you with everything you need to make tasty meals from scratch in the comfort of your own kitchen. It's so easy to get stuck in a routine with food. Whenever I go to the supermarket, I tend to stick to the same old boring meals week after week, which then increases the temptation to get takeaways, which are expensive and probably quite unhealthy. But with HelloFresh, this temptation and boredom melts away. You can pick from loads of different delicious meals that you wouldn't ever normally think of cooking, and all of the ingredients come measured out, so it takes the stress out of the preparation process and you can get stuck in with the fun part. These recipe cards make the entire thing a breeze, and the end result is always stunning. I mean, just gaze upon this creamy tomato Cajun chicken. Before you start drooling all over the floor, you too can get started with HelloFresh. Just click the link in the description or use the code on screen now and get 16 free meals and free desserts for life while your subscription is active. You can also scan the QR code on the screen or visit hellofresh.com for more information. Now, if you don't mind, I need to finish off this Cajun chicken. The actual build quality of the RGB30 isn't really anything to shout about. It's fairly light and the plastic shell feels a little bit cheap. But the buttons and D-pad are surprisingly nice to the touch. They have a rubber membrane connection which gives them a good amount of resistance, and they're satisfying to press. The analog sticks on the left and right are very similar to the Switch Joy-Con style ones that a lot of devices like this use. These are set back into the shell of the device, so they shouldn't snag on anything if you're putting it in your pocket or inside of a bag. On the top we've got inline shoulder buttons, the volume controls, a reset button and the power button, along with a mini HDMI out, which I love to see on devices like this because it gives them slightly more versatility. On the bottom we've got 2 USB ports, one for connecting peripherals and the other for charging. There's also 2 micro SD card ports, one for the OS and the other for your ROM files, and we've even got a headphone jack too. Overall, despite the sort of cheap plastic feeling of the shell, there's a lot to love here. PowKiddy haven't skimped out on any of the ports here, and some of these are sometimes missing from other devices. So I would say that so far, things are already looking pretty good. If we delve a little bit deeper and take a look at the specs, we'll find an RK3566 CPU, 1GB of RAM, and a 4100 mAh battery. In terms of the raw power offered here, this isn't very impressive. This basically means that you're not going to stand a chance of playing PS2 or GameCube games, and even certain demanding Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 titles might struggle a little bit. In terms of extras, we also have built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it runs using Jealous as its operating system. This basically means that you can use it right out of the box with very minimal tinkering because everything is pre-configured pretty well. The thing that really saves the RGB30 though is this weird screen. It's a 720 by 720 resolution, which considering it's only 4 inches big, is gonna look absolutely stunning. But the real secret weapon here is the fact that the aspect ratio is 1:1. This means that it's perfectly square, something that's very uncommon with devices in this price range and kind of uncommon in general. Now you might be wondering why you would even want a square screen like this in the first place, and the most obvious answer to that question is to play any systems that utilise a 1:1 aspect ratio, or at least something that comes close to that. So now let's go ahead with a little bit of game testing and see why you might want to pick this up over certain other devices. The console that immediately springs to mind to test out first is of course the Game Boy, which if we're getting super specific actually has a 10:9 aspect ratio, but that's very close to 1:1 and is gonna look great. Game Boy games are gonna almost fill the entire screen and look absolutely insane with a 720p display because that allows for an upscale of around 4 times the native resolution. If you set the RGB30 to have an integer scale instead, the pixels will be perfectly upscaled to fit on the screen with no stretching or distortion, but this does result in some bigger black bars on the top and bottom. This is due to the fact that you are still working with a 10:9 aspect ratio, which won't perfectly fit the screen. Personally though, I don't actually mind not having this perfect integer scale with this system because it's so close to matching the 1:1 screen anyway that it doesn't really affect anything by stretching it that tiny bit more. Other systems that closely match the RGB30's display are the Neo Geo Pocket and the Game Gear, which are going to look incredible on this device. But what about all of those other systems that don't quite match up with a 1:1 display? Any systems with a standard 4:3 aspect ratio are going to be playable on here, but will of course have black bars on the top and bottom because they weren't designed to be displayed on a screen this tall. What this results in though is the equivalent of a screen that's 3.5 inches if you only count the area of the screen that's being used by gameplay. Now this is small, but it's not unplayable by any means, and the high resolution of the screen actually makes some of these games look really crisp. It's clearly not an ideal setup, but if you didn't have another option to emulate these games, it would definitely get the job done. Where things get even more interesting though is with Game Boy Advance games, which can be upscaled to 3 times their native resolution while maintaining a perfect integer scale thanks to its 240x160 resolution. This means that the pixels aren't going to be stretched here at all, and things are going to look just as good as they do on the original hardware, if not even better. The only thing to consider is that you are still going to have those black bars on the top and bottom of the screen, but you're even going to get those on devices like the Analog Pocket. That's just the nature of having a square screen or even a 4:3 screen and attempting to play systems with that wider aspect ratio. And it is worth mentioning that if you're playing a GBA game on an Analog Pocket, the screen is actually going to work out to be smaller than on the RGB30 because the Analog Pocket screen is only 3.5 inches and the added black bars on GBA games will make that even smaller. Whereas on the RGB30, GBA games are effectively being displayed on a 3.4-inch screen when you take into consideration the black bars. So yeah, both the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance stuff is very good on here, and it might legitimately be a great alternative to the mighty Analog Pocket. NES and SNES look pretty great out of the box. Because typically they would default to having a standard 4:3 aspect ratio, it makes it the same as playing something like a PlayStation title. But if you wanted to get technical here, you could change the aspect ratio to 8:7, which will fill much more of the screen without distorting the visuals in any majorly impactful way. In fact, some people prefer this aspect ratio for these systems anyway. This isn't a perfect integer scale though, so you are going to see some very minor visual distortion, but I feel like most people wouldn't even pick up on this. With SNES specifically, you can actually use a 3 times integer scale by overscanning the image so that it crops off the very edges of the gameplay. However, this is only getting rid of a tiny amount of pixels on the left and right, which means that you're getting a near perfect image that's taking up almost the entire screen, and it just looks insane. Other systems you might be interested in are ones that feature a vertical aspect ratio or utilize multiple screens. The square screen having a taller aspect ratio than most other devices would mean that these systems should make better use of the space available, and you would think that the DS would be a good example of this. But the problem is that the RGB30 doesn't have a touchscreen, meaning that a lot of games would be rendered unplayable or lose some of the functionality. So unfortunately, I wouldn't really recommend this for DS stuff. And yeah, you can obviously play a lot of games by using the right stick to emulate the touchscreen and use the single screen mode to fill up more space on the display. But even so, it's still not exactly an ideal setup for this particular system. However, when we look at vertical arcade games, the RGB30 once again shows how amazing this screen is. Normally, when you play these games on a 4x3 display, the black bars on the sides of the screen are massive. This is because a 4x3 display is wider than it is tall. But here we have a display that's just as tall as it is wide, which means that those black bars are reduced and the screen appears more filled out. Then we have Pico 8, which is a system that never actually physically existed, but is a made-up fantasy console which is used by passionate indie developers to create small creative experiences, while being limited in terms of power and graphics. And wouldn't you know it, the aspect ratio of these Pico 8 games are a perfect 1:1, making the RGB30 the perfect Pico 8 player. Now you do need to buy Pico 8, but it's a one-time payment, and once you've purchased the software, all of the games are completely free and there's huge amounts of them. You could literally get the RGB30 just to play Pico 8 stuff and you would never run out of things to be trying out. So to sum up, it turns out that a screen at this aspect ratio and resolution has a lot more utilization than I initially thought. It turns out that devices like this that have more of a specific niche in mind are the ones that I potentially find the most interesting. While we all enjoy devices that offer a lot of power and can play practically any system under the sun, a lot of the time, because they aren't based around playing any particular system specifically, they can end up underperforming in some key areas. Most of the time this comes down to the feel or placement of the D-pad, or maybe the trigger and shoulder positioning being bad, but here we have a device that seems almost purpose-built for a specific set of systems, and it caters to those games perfectly. You don't need loads of power because you're not going to want to go up to PS2 or GameCube on a device like this. The D-pad is placed in the prime upper left location, which makes it more comfortable to use than on most other devices. And yeah, the shoulder buttons are in line, but the vast majority of the consoles it aims to emulate either don't have shoulder buttons, or only use one on either side, so that's not even a problem here. I'm actually struggling to come up with anything bad to say here, because it just does what it's intended to do, and does it almost perfectly. Even the jealous front end looks great and is easy to navigate and configure. The price is amazing too. It's currently $90 on the PowKiddy website, and when you consider that the closest direct competition to this, at least in terms of its screen, is probably the Analog Pocket, the RGB30 is $130 cheaper, and potentially more importantly, this is actually always in stock, so that's gotta make it worth at least considering as an alternative. The only negative is that the screen could potentially be a little bit bigger, and I do think that the plastic shell makes it feel a little bit cheap at first. It could also potentially have slightly more power just to be able to play more N64 and Dreamcast stuff a bit better, but honestly, if you're wanting to play systems that require an analog stick, you might as well go for another device entirely where the stick is positioned in the top left. The PowKiddy RGB30 has to get 9 dodos out of 10. Literally give this thing a more premium shell and maybe have it be half an inch or maybe even a full inch bigger, and it would be perfection. Even as it is now though, it's so damn close to perfection that I would recommend this to anyone that's looking for a device catered for Game Boy systems or those pre-5th gen consoles. I think we need more handhelds like this that are more specifically crafted for a certain era or style of game. I suppose another example of this would be the Aeneo Flip DS, which would be the perfect DS, 3DS and Wii U emulator, and also the Anbernic RG Arc, which is tailored to Sega Saturn and Mega Drive games. I think this stuff carves out a really good niche in a marketplace that often boils down to which devices are the most powerful. But the RGB30 shows that this isn't always the most important thing to be looking at. But what do you think of the PowKiddy RGB30? Have you already got one? And if so, what's your favourite system to play on it? And if you haven't got one yet, then are you tempted to pick one up after seeing what it's capable of? Let me know. A big thanks goes out to today's sponsor HelloFresh for keeping me fed throughout all of this game testing. Remember to check out all of their details in the description below to take advantage of all of the deals. Also remember to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro stuff coming soon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.